Thank you so much for joining us tonight at our President's Day celebration. We are in for a real treat, and I'm glad that you could all join us. For some of you who haven't met me yet, I'm proud to say that I myself am a graduate of the Peter C. Cook Leadership Academy. I went on to be a mentor for the program. Then I was a groupie of the Hauenstein Center for a long time. And I was just telling someone in the reception, I think I'm chief groupie now, which I don't know if that'll fit on my name tag, but we might need to work on that. So again, very pleased to be here. And I attribute a lot of the success that I have found in both my personal and professional career to my experience with the Hauenstein Center. So thank you all for your support. You all are the ones who helped make that happen. So tonight we are thrilled to be hosting all of you to hear Kate Andersen Brower provide some insightful behind-the-scenes stories from the lives of some of our presidents and their families. But prior to getting started, I want to make note of a few guests who are with us tonight, and especially our friends from the Ford Presidential Library and Museum. Brick and Joel are both here, and it's because of their partnership that we were able to bring Kate. So let's give them some thanks for helping make that happen. It is now my privilege. As many of you know, the Peter C. Cook Leadership Academy is a big part of the work that we do at the Hauenstein Center. And I'm thrilled to be able to present one of our leadership fellow candidates this evening to share a leadership moment and also to introduce our speaker. So with that, let me give you a little bit of the backstory of Faith Kidd. Faith Kidd is a senior at Grand Valley who will be graduating in April, yay, with a political science major and international business minor. During her time at Grand Valley, she's made a point to get involved with everything that she could possibly fit in her schedule. She is a member of the Frederick Myers Honors College, where she has mentored and also served as a teaching assistant. She's a second-year CLA fellow candidate and a member of the Model EU Club. Faith has completed an intensive national security seminar in Washington, D.C. She served on multiple e-boards. She worked for the Hauenstein Center during the 21-22 school year. And oh, by the way, she's currently president of the Student Senate. Prior to coming to GVSU, Faith completed her Associates of Arts through ASM Tech, which is an early college program that works in conjunction with West Shore Community College. And after graduation, Faith plans on completing the LSAT and applying to JD and PhD programs all over the world. Her career goal is to either teach at the university level or work in an NGO think tank, but she's looking forward to a gap year in the meantime. Faith is passionate about women's rights, LGBTQ+ rights, educational equity, and everything that sparkles. In her free time, you can find her trying new foods, dancing, or being a social butterfly. While her resume of accomplishments are extremely impressive, one of my favorite things about Faith is her everyday leadership and humility. I remember having a conversation with her once last summer where she told me a story about how she was a server at a very prestigious golf club in northern Michigan. And some professional sports players happened to come in after a round of golf, and her manager sent her over to the table knowing that she would treat them and respect them just as well and just as normally as she would anyone else. And so that really is the epitome of Faith Kidd and who she is and the work that she does in conjunction with the Cook Leadership Academy and throughout her many roles at Grand Valley. And with that, I'd love to welcome her to the stage.
Hi, everybody. First of all, thank you for being here this evening. I am not waitressing tonight, so I'm going to celebrate that before I get into this speech. But my name is Faith Kidd, and I am a Peter C. Cook Leadership Academy fellow candidate. I was invited to speak today during the President's Day celebration because in my free time, I dabble as the student body president at Grand Valley State University. By definition, I Googled this one. A president holds the executive office of a country, state, company, or other large organization. But I want to start my remarks today by recognizing that every good leader has a great team working behind the scenes. In the US, the president is a figurehead, and almost everyone knows the name of the president. But not everyone knows the name of the Secretary of State or the Secretary of the Treasury. And to be any good at presidency, you have to have a fabulous cabinet. So my cabinet is amazing. They keep me sane or close to sane. I have 6 vice presidents that work beneath me and manage their own committees. And then in addition to that, I have an executive vice president, and he schedules all of my meetings and takes all of my phone calls and fields all of my emails and makes sure I wake up on time. And in addition to doing all of those things that are not in his job, he also manages all of my vice presidents and the work that they're doing. And in addition to doing their own work on their own committees, my vice presidents are actively acting as liaisons between students and administration and spearheading major projects. For example, this year, we worked on legislation that would increase the wages of all students. And while they're busy on the ground doing all of these meaningful things, I am in meetings and on phone calls and in interviews and making public appearances like this one. I have 9 speaking arrangements in the next 10 days. And so being in a high-level role, kind of similar to the one I serve in currently, has completely shifted my outlook on life and my dream jobs and overall my leadership philosophy. If you would have met me 2 years ago when I started at Grand Valley, I would have told you that I was going to be a CEO, and I was going to be president of the United States, and I was going to run a think tank and all of these fabulous things that I'm still considering them, but I don't dream of being on top anymore. Now that I've served in a role that consists of public speaking arrangements and chairing meetings and responding to major things in formal statements, I realize how important the people on the ground making the changes are. And Megan and I were actually just discussing this. I tell all my friends and family every day that I would go back to a vice presidential role, or that I would just drop everything and take a flight overseas to go volunteer and do mission trips, or that I would, once again, drop everything, go overseas and teach English at any given moment. And don't get me wrong, I would not trade the opportunities and experiences I've had at Grand Valley for anything in the world. It's been so difficult, yet so rewarding. But I am a firm believer that leaders eat last. And this opportunity is a perfect opportunity to recognize the people who make my job possible and who are actively making life better for students here at Grand Valley. A president is a figurehead. The cabinet members are the real heroes. I spend a lot of time caught up in meetings, responding to emails, and being interviewed. And these are all important things. You need someone to answer the questions. But I miss connecting with students, and I find that there's a great deal of meaning in the work done off the stage. So thank you to the Cook Leadership Academy for helping me become a more empathetic and kind leader. I still love the stage. And thank you to everyone who makes my job easier and who makes life for students better here at Grand Valley. My name is Faith Kidd, and I am a leader. And I now have the honor of introducing Kate Andersen Brower, who is our speaker this evening. She is the author of the #1 New York Times bestseller, The Residents Inside the Private World of the White House and First Women, which is also, in addition to Team of 5, which is also a New York Times bestseller, First in Line, and then the children's book, Exploring the White House. The Residents is being made into a television series produced by Shonda Rhimes for Netflix, and she produced Grey's Anatomy, just saying. Her book, Elizabeth Taylor, is the first authorized biography of the icon. Brower covered the White House for Bloomberg News and Business Week, and as part of the White House press corps, traveled across the U.S. and around the globe on Air Force One, accompanying President Obama on dozens of trips, including stops in Colombia, Poland, Ireland, France, England, and Portugal. She was also assigned to cover First Lady Michelle Obama and Vice President Joe Biden. She was one of only 3 reporters who traveled with the Vice President to Mongolia, China, and Japan. Brower is a graduate of Barnard College with a master's degree from Oxford University. She covered the Obama administration for Bloomberg News and is a former CBS News staffer and Fox News producer. She's written for the New York Times, Vanity Fair, and the Washington Post. She currently lives outside of Washington, D.C. with her husband, their 3 young children, and their Wheaton Terrier. So please join me in welcoming Kate Andersen Brower.
When I grow up someday, I want to come back as Faith because that was amazing. The confidence is incredible. And I love what you're doing here. I think it's such a beautiful school. And what you're all doing at the Hauenstein Center is wonderful. And I know several speakers who've been here, and I've really enjoyed my time in Grand Rapids, which, you know, I've never spent a lot of time here before. So it's been a fun trip. As Faith was saying, my first book was called The Residence, and it is very close to my heart because it's the favorite book that I've ever worked on, and I got to know so many incredible people who work in the White House on the staff. But before I go into that, because we are here at the birthplace, well, not the birthplace, the childhood home of Gerald Ford, and where he grew up, I want to go into my favorite Gerald Ford, Betty Ford stories. From The Residence, one of the things I talk about in the book is the transition between the outgoing president and the incoming president. And one of the most astounding transitions, of course, happened on August 9th, 1974, when the resident staff took on the familiar role of movers that day. So the resident staff, there are about 100 people, and they're working at the White House as we speak. These are carpenters, cooks, butlers, housekeepers, and they're there from one administration to the next. And I had the privilege of interviewing dozens of them who had been there when I started working on the book in 2011. So these are folks who worked for the Carters, the Kennedys, the Nixons. I mean, they saw so much history, and it was inspirational. And I also had the privilege of talking to several first ladies about what the staff meant to them. And Barbara Bush told me that on that day, August 9th, 1974, her husband, George H.W. Bush, was chairman of the Republican National Committee at that time. And she described in amazement witnessing just how quickly the White House went from one administration to the next, handed over from the Nixons to the Fords. The staff didn't even know what was happening until they were told to go get the moving boxes because Watergate had dragged on for so long. She told me the day President Nixon resigned, we went down to that White House. We met there for his resignation and Jerry Ford swearing in hours later. After we waved goodbye to the Nixons, the pictures on the wall were all of the Ford family. And we were standing at the helicopter waving goodbye while they actually changed the pictures out. And the Nixons' formal style was replaced by the more relaxed attitude of the Fords, who allowed their 4 children to wear jeans anywhere in the White House. Susan Ford even roller skated on the State Floor's pristine floors while her parents were traveling. And she said she was embarrassed to admit that when we spoke, but I thought it was very sweet. Betty Ford was fiercely independent, and when she got the tour of the second floor family quarters, she immediately rejected the idea of sleeping in a separate bedroom from her husband. Well, there'll be no need for that, she told the head usher. And I talked to carpenter Milton Frame, who was really impressed, and I can't believe the carpenter's name was Milton Frame, but it was. He was really impressed by Mrs. Ford's approachable manner, and he talked about how she would invite him to have tea in the residence and just how different it was from Pat Nixon, who was so much more formal. And she also enjoyed teasing the staff. During a tour of the private quarters, her press secretary noticed a flower vase featuring the figures of 2 angels with their hands almost touching. A cigarette was perched in one of the angels' hands. The First Lady said, "Oh, I just put it there as a way of testing whether the maids have cleaned the room." She just had fun, and she did things her own way. And of course, I will talk about Betty Ford because she's one of my favorite first ladies a little bit later and the more serious side of what she did. Steve Ford, I really think one of the things that's most fascinating to me is the family and how living in the White House affects the children who live there. And, Steve Ford was just a couple weeks away from starting his freshman year at Duke in 1974 when his father was suddenly thrust into the presidency. All of a sudden, he told me, we got 10 Secret Service agents and life changed. And trust me, at 18 years old, that's not really the group you're hoping to hang out with. And he also told me a great story, and I'm sure the folks from the Ford Library know about it. But he invited a friend of his, because for a few days they were still living at their home in Alexandria, and he invited his next door neighbor to come to the White House shortly after they moved in. And he said, you've got to come over and see this place. And they climbed up onto the roof and blasted Zeppelin's Stairway to Heaven. And one of the things that I thought was fascinating about that is that Eugene Allen, and if you've seen the movie The Butler, it's based on his life, a wonderful movie. He knew what they did, but he was never going to judge anyone or rat them out to the family. So that there were no moral billy clubs, I was told again and again, that it was just almost that the resident staff was trying to protect the kids because they knew how hard it was for them to live in the White House. And then there's another great, I won't go on with the Ford stories, but because we're in Grand Rapids, I also love the fact that Gerald Ford famously had the pool put in at the White House, but he also swam with some of the resident staff, including with a doorman named Freddie Mayfield. He knew that he liked to swim, they had chatted about it, and they just hung out and swam laps together a couple of times, which I think is really very sweet. And then a final favorite Ford story of mine is about when the Queen came to visit Washington in 1976 to celebrate the bicentennial. She had been to the White House several times. And just before this white tie state dinner, the Fords, following tradition, met the Queen and Prince Philip at the entrance to the diplomatic reception room. They escorted the royal couple to the elevator on their way to spend a few minutes in the residence to chat before dinner. As they waited for the elevator to take them upstairs, it suddenly opened to reveal the president's 24-year-old son, Jack, who was wearing jeans and a t-shirt. Hardly appropriate attire for a royal greeting. Without missing a beat, the Queen turned to Betty Ford and said, "Don't worry, Betty, I have one of those at home too," referring to Prince Charles. So the story is about these friendships and the families. That's what I really try to focus on in my work. And I also think it gives you unique insight into leadership and what it takes to be president and first lady, because I consider that a job as well. This is one of my favorite photos of butlers. On your far right is Eugene Allen, and they're sitting in the state dining room getting ready for a dinner. And I got to meet a lot of them who had this kind of informal group of butlers in Washington who would go around and serve at parties when they weren't working at the White House, because every Washington hostess wanted to say that she had a White House butler working for her. So they helped each other out. And when one person wasn't available, they would recommend a friend. A lot of them are African American. It was a very prestigious job. And it still is. They don't see themselves as servants, And when I've mentioned the word servant, does that bother them? They actually don't find that offensive at all, because they're serving the most important family in the world, and they see it as a great honor. So I was lucky to talk to some of the very last people who were there at the White House when the Kennedys were in office, including Nelson Pierce, who was an usher at the White House. And he remembered Jackie Kennedy coming back with her husband's body and the trauma of the assassination. And here's Jackie with Preston Bruce, the white-haired man on her right, who was a doorman, longtime doorman at the White House. And he had passed away by the time I started working on this book. But fortunately, he left a wonderful memoir called From the Door of the White House, if anyone's really interested in White House history. It's a fantastic book. And he talks about Robert Kennedy and Jackie Kennedy coming into the White House elevator and just sobbing after the body was brought back. And it made me think that really the only place the president and the family can feel safe and private is in the elevator, because there's always a sense that people are watching you, I think. I went all around Washington and got some great firsthand interviews. This is Linwood Restray, one of my favorite folks to interview, who was there for the Carters. And then this is Nelson Pierce, who was there when the Fords were in office, and the Kennedys. I mean, he served for years and years. This is, we have Henry Haller, who was a White House chef, Eugene Allen there, and they are all talking to Steve Ford, just chatting in the hallway before dinner. And I think there was this great relationship with the kids and the service staff at the White House. And like I said, I mean, the Bush daughters had a raging party that Jenna talked about, where they had some friends go up to the roof and actually try to touch the flag on the roof of the White House. And you know, one of the ushers had to stop them from doing this. They had been drinking and it was wild. And the parents were out of town and no one told anybody. So it is this feeling of protecting the kids. I was asked earlier what one of my favorite stories of the White House is. And now that we're all thinking a lot about Jimmy Carter, I think that this is probably my favorite story, this is Mary Prince and Amy Carter on the South Lawn of the White House. And Mary's story is just phenomenal. It's that she was convicted of first-degree murder in Georgia. And she was on a work release kind of program through the state. And she and several other prisoners were working at the governor's mansion, where they were doing work outside in the gardens, being very carefully monitored. And the Carters noticed that Mary and Amy had somehow developed a bond. And Amy just loved playing with her outside, and they just really took to each other. And Mary loves Amy, still does. And the Carters looked into the case. Rosalind Carter in particular was very interested in Mary's case, and found out that Mary did not have adequate legal representation. She was Black in the South. This was in the 70s. And in fact, Mary told me she had only met her lawyer for like 5 minutes before the trial. So the Carters took it upon themselves to try to get Mary to work in the governor's mansion, which they insisted upon it, as Amy's nanny when she was just a little girl. And this is from the time she was, 5, 6 years old. And then when they went to the White House, they got Mary, they had permission, they had to go through the system where Jimmy Carter was Mary's parole officer, actually, when he was president, and had Mary come and live with them in the White House residence. She had a room on the 3rd floor. And she took care of Amy. And she, as you see, there's a huge bond between them. And she still works for the family. And she still is very, very close to Amy Carter, helped Amy raise her son. And I went down to Plains, Georgia, and she's just an incredible woman, and I can't believe a movie hasn't been made about her life story yet. So, but the Carters really helped her immensely, but she also helped herself, and it's just a beautiful story, and their friendship is very sweet. This is Christine Limerick. So a lot of the residence is built on interviews I did with the White House staff directly. And she was the head housekeeper during the Clintons and the Bush years. And she is a wonderful woman who kind of connected me to a lot of other people. And it was funny because she told me her father was so disappointed when she started being housekeeper at the Mayflower Hotel in DC, which is a very fancy hotel. And he was disappointed. He wanted her to, go on to law school and do all these other things. And then when she got promoted and she got this job at the White House, she said, well, what do you think of me being a toilet bowl cleaner at the most famous house in the world? You're not so disappointed now. So she's a fascinating woman. This is James Ramsey. I think it's a beautiful picture because it's in profile. He was a White House butler, very close with the Bush family, so tight with them, with Jenna and Barbara, that they would talk about who he was dating and who they were dating. I mean, these are like family to the staff. George H.W. Bush and Barbara Bush were the favorite of all the resident staff. They just absolutely loved the Bushes, and it just didn't matter who I asked. Even if they were Democrats, they really separate their politics from the people. And George H.W. Bush would have these horseshoe competitions on the South Lawn. And they were really into it. This is Lindsay Little, who is a houseman, and I won't go into the details, but there's different jobs on the housekeeping staff, and the houseman is in charge of moving the heavy furniture, helping to set up TV interviews in the White House and such. And there he is wearing a Houseman's Pride t-shirt. They actually got t-shirts made up. And he said that the Houseman team beat the Bush every single year except the last one. They let him win, which was sweet. This is Barbara Bush, of course. She's in the flower shop in the basement. She loved going down into the basement where all the different shops are, they call them. The carpenter shop, the flower shop, the pastry shop. She called the pastry chef the cookie man. And she would come down in her bathing suit on her way out to the pool that the Fords built and do laps. And she would have her bathing suit on, with a bathrobe over it, just really relaxed. And I think a lot of that is because the Bushes were very used to having staff. And they were used to having people around them. It's much harder for people who aren't used to that. The Carters struggled more. The Obamas struggled more. The Clintons, the feeling of always being watched, I think, is harder for some people. And here are the Clintons. The day they move out of the White House, you can see James Ramsey's in the back there. And the day that they left, the tradition is that they say goodbye to the staff. And there's usually not a dry eye in the house. They just really, as mushy as it sounds, it is legit. And I can say that when I went into this as a journalist who's kind of skeptical, I thought, well, surely people who loved Obama won't have loved working for Trump. And really, unless everyone was too scared to say it, they really do have intense affection for both the Trumps and the Obamas, because it's about how they're treated. And I did say earlier that I did hear that this is through two of the resident staff who are still there, that Donald Trump, when he was president, would occasionally slip the staff $50 bills in cash, which is definitely not allowed. But that might be one reason why they liked him. This is James Ramsey, the butler I was talking about earlier, who is such a great, as a journalist, you would call him a source, but I thought he was also a friend. And at his funeral, Laura Bush and Jenna Bush spoke. So it was very heartfelt, and they really felt like a member of their family had passed away. And he had a great sense of humor. He just brought a lightness because when the president gets off the elevator on the second floor, he's really home, and it's the only place where he can be comfortable. This is part of that photo, that day that I showed of the Clintons leaving. This is the Bushes leaving. So fast forward years later. And this is Stephen Rochon, who was the chief usher. And the chief usher is the person who basically runs the house, kind of like the general manager of a hotel. And he is presenting George W. Bush with the American flag that flew on his first day in office on the White House, and the flag that flew during his last full day in office. And so for every president, they make the carpenter's shop makes a cedar box that you see there, and they present it to the departing president and the family. And it's just, it's usually a very, very emotional day. And I think it's so interesting because our eyes are trained on what's going on at the Capitol for the swearing-in ceremony, but I think what's going on behind the scenes at the White House on that day is so much more interesting. Normally, though, this didn't happen with Melania Trump and Jill Biden, which I still think was really a shame because it's an important part of our American tradition, is Laura Bush inviting Michelle Obama to the residence to talk about, what to expect. And it's really a meaningful moment where they bond, they have this private meeting. And in this case, Jenna and Barbara Bush hung out with Malia and Sasha Obama and showed them this one staircase you can slide down. So it's a really sweet, sweet moment. This is a fun photo that shows the operations department at the White House. And they are this team of staff who literally are moving one family in and another out. And, you know, the head of the operations department told me that inauguration day is showtime for them. It's the most important day. And it's all hands on deck because they don't hire outside moving companies for security reasons. It would just be very complicated to have strangers wandering around the White House. So all of them have been cleared and gone through all the necessary steps to get clearance. So they're the ones moving all of the things in. But even then, things do get lost. I mean, when the Clintons moved in, Hillary Clinton couldn't find her inaugural gown. And that was very stressful because you only have a very short period of time where you can, between the inaugural, the swearing in, the parade, and then you've got all these balls to go through. This is Stephen Rochon, the chief usher, who is also a high-level officer in the Coast Guard, and he's walking with Barack Obama. One of the jobs of the chief usher is escorting the president to the Oval Office every day. And that's when you can also hear a litany of complaints and problems that are happening. And at one point, Stephen Rochon told me that, you know, Obama said, "When is the basketball court getting done? You promised me, you know, and the water pressure isn't right." I mean, this is when you get those kinds of complaints because you're living in a house and you want certain things to happen. Michelle Obama with George Haney, another White House butler. The Obamas actually took one of the assistant ushers and hired him to work for them. So sometimes that happens and he's working for them now. They just grew very, very close to him. My next book was First Women because I really felt like when I would ask the resident staff what it's like working at the White House, they would always say, "We just listen to the second floor, and whatever the second floor wants us to do, we do." And I said, "What's the second floor?" And they said, "The First Lady. You know, that is who we are answering to. The president, one day, hopefully, we have a first gentleman and the roles are reversed. But the president's too busy doing other things. It's the First Lady that they have to answer to." I love this photo. Lady Bird Johnson is an incredible First Lady who, you know, put up with a lot, actually, from Lyndon Johnson. And the more I researched and talked to people, I was kind of astounded to know how hard it was for people during the Johnson years. In fact, it got so bad that the head plumber at the White House had a nervous breakdown because Lyndon Johnson was essentially a manic depressive. It was described to me by many of his closest friends. He was very difficult to deal with and had these highs and lows, and he could be verbally abusive towards Lady Bird and also to the White House staff. And the chief plumber at the time, this man named Reds Arrington, he had a shock of bright red hair, was basically driven crazy for 5 years by Lyndon Johnson because Johnson wanted the shower pressure in the presidential bathroom to come in like a fire hose. He wanted it really hot, really intense. And so for 5 years, Reds did everything he could to make him happy. And Johnson would bellow and say, you know, "I can move 10,000 troops in a day in Vietnam. You can make this shower any way I want it." And it just never worked. They installed pumps. They did all sorts of work trying to get the shower to be up to Johnson's expectations. And then Richard Nixon came in, of course, and took one look at it and said, "Get rid of all this stuff," because there were all these strange nozzles pointing in different directions. But the friendship between the First Ladies, to me, was really beautiful because, like the presidents, there are only a handful of women who know what it's like. This is at Kennedy's inauguration. You have Jackie, Lady Bird, Mamie Eisenhower, and Pat Nixon. And one of the things that I love about this picture is it reminds me of the friendship that developed between Jackie and Pat. Now, their husbands were obviously rivals, but the first time that Jackie Kennedy ever came back to the White House was at Pat Nixon's invitation in 1971. She never wanted to return to it. It was so traumatic for her, what had happened to her husband. Finally, when they left Washington, when she would come back to DC, she would make sure that the car got nowhere near the White House. She didn't want to see it or be reminded of what happened. And so for the official portrait unveiling, Pat Nixon convinced her somehow to come and bring her children. So Jackie brought John Kennedy Jr. and Caroline Kennedy, and it was really a very emotional thing because they were going through the rooms that they remembered from their, I don't think John F. Kennedy Jr. could have remembered that much, but Caroline said it smelled familiar. And they just, it was a moment that Jackie said she had always dreaded. And she wrote this beautiful note in the Kennedy Library. I found it where she says to Pat Nixon, the day I had always dreaded turned out to be one of the most beautiful days I've ever spent with my children. And so I think that those stories of a Democrat and a Republican, we could use more of that. It was wonderful for the resident staff to have the Kennedy children in the White House because Letitia Baldridge, Kennedy's social secretary, talked about these little girls, doing ballet and dancing in their beautiful costumes on the South Lawn, and the preschool that was up in the solarium that Caroline Kennedy went to, that Jackie Kennedy created for her. And I thought it was really interesting. Nelson Pierce told me this, one of the ushers at the time, that even after the assassination, which was, of course, in November, they wanted Caroline to finish school. And so she would come back and forth to the White House and go to school. And the staff, at first didn't know what to say to this little girl whose father had just been killed. But they started to see that it was really healthy for her to come back to the house and finish out that part with her friends, which I thought was really sweet. This is one of the best Betty Ford photos, of course, and the Ford Library folks know it well. There she is in the cabinet room, standing on the table, and she told David Hume Kennerly, the Ford's official photographer and close friend, that this was the closest she'd get to a seat at the table. And she was a Martha Graham dancer. Betty Ford is one of my favorite first ladies, and probably my favorite, if I'm being honest, but because of what she did after she left the White House with the Betty Ford Center, but also when she was First Lady, what she did to make people aware of the importance of getting mammograms, because she's one of the first ladies, I think it might be even the first, to come out publicly and talk about a health scare, a health diagnosis, and say specifically what it was. When Gerald Ford's advisors said to her when she was diagnosed with breast cancer that she should go ahead and they could issue a press release just saying the First Lady is having a health problem, she said, I want you to say exactly what it is. Because back then, it's hard to believe, but breast cancer was not something people spoke about. It was seen, you wouldn't say breast in public. And the fact that she did that saved countless lives, and people started getting mammograms. People started writing to the Fords. Husbands started writing to President Ford, thanking him for, what they knew he was also going through. So I think what she did was pretty phenomenal. Rosalind Carter and Jimmy Carter, Rosalind would demand weekly lunches with her husband, which I also love. She would come out of the second floor residence, he would be exhausted, and she would have this binder of just things she wanted to go through with him at the end of every day. And he finally just said, I can't do this every night. Let's schedule a weekly lunch where we can talk about issues. And I think you can see her very intently here. I've interviewed both Carters, and Rosalind is just a spitfire, incredible woman who did so much work on mental health that I didn't even realize until I started working on this book. She's the second First Lady to testify before Congress. The first was Eleanor Roosevelt. And she thought that mental health was something that shouldn't have the stigma attached to it. And it still does, of course, but it's gotten so much better. And she thought that mental health should be tied to healthcare, and there should be, no shame in talking about going to a psychiatrist or psychologist or any of that. And back then, that was pretty forward thinking. So Lady Bird and Barbara Bush had a really great relationship, so much fun. Barbara Bush, like I said, just one of the most beloved first ladies. And what Lady Bird did with highway beautification is also pretty incredible, making that an issue, because first ladies, of course, have to come up with their campaign, and no matter what it is, they're going to offend somebody. And I'm sure the billboard companies didn't like highway beautification, because back then in the 60s there were, billboards everywhere, and what Lady Bird wanted to do is plant flowers and make it more beautiful. And she was really the grounding force for LBJ. I mean, without her, he could not have been president. This is a great photo of Betty Ford, Lady Bird, and Rosalind Carter. This is at the Ford Ranch in Texas. And they were being interviewed for Ladies' Home Journal at the time, and they were hanging out, and a car drove by them, and all these flash bulbs went off because nobody expected to see three. They might have thought they'd see Lady Bird Johnson, but not Betty Ford and Rosalind Carter. So it was really exciting for the people who were there. I think this photo kind of says it all in terms of, I think Nancy Reagan and Barbara Bush did not get along, especially. And Nancy Reagan really saw it, and this is no surprise. Her number one job was protecting her husband. That is all she cared about. And she was basically the human resources department at the White House when he was president. She was determining who was going to be around him and who he could trust. And there was a lot of, I was told in my reporting for this book, that also Nancy felt a bit threatened by the Bushes and how tight that family was, whereas the Reagans had difficult relationships with their children. And I interviewed Ron Reagan Jr., the president's son, who told me that he thought it was unfair that his mom took a lot of the brunt of the criticism, that his dad was always kind of jovial and well-liked, whereas his mom, if someone needed to be fired or yelled at, she was often the one to do it. And he was able to kind of stay well-liked and even loved in the White House. I wrote a book called First in Line about the vice presidency. This is a great quote. "I am vice president. In this, I am nothing, but I may be everything." And I think we're thinking a lot about that now, especially as we are moving into the next election. And there's so much talk about Joe Biden running again and Kamala Harris and what it means to be vice president. And if you're working for an older president, you're obviously very much front and center in any campaign in a way that I don't think Biden was when Obama was running. So it's definitely what a lot of people are talking about and thinking about now. The Bushes and the Reagans here at the Naval Observatory, they were not, as I said, especially close. The Bushes did not get invited up to the residence. I think that families really guard that space so much that even the Bidens didn't get up to the residence. They were friends with the Obamas, friendly, but that's like your private inner sanctum when you are president, and very few people get invited up there. Of course, Dan Quayle, I interviewed every vice president for this book, and when I went to talk to Dan Quayle, it was one of the most awkward interviews I've done, because he right away said, "I read what you wrote about my wife in your last book, and I didn't like it very much." And I hadn't said anything really bad at all, but I guess he is very still upset about the way that he was treated. That the fact that he famously couldn't spell potato, or, he says he was kind of flummoxed at that moment. He thinks he was left kind of as the punching bag. And I think that happens a lot with vice presidents. Of course, the Clintons and the Gores. I mentioned earlier my conversation with Al Gore for this book was also kind of awkward now that I think of it. I asked him what he thought about being vice president with the most active first lady in the White House. And he said, I think our conversation is about to come to a close early. That is not something that he wanted to talk about because obviously, in a typical White House, the East Wing, where the First Lady's purview does not have anywhere near the amount of sway it does in the Clinton White House. I love this photo, although I'm not sure if you can see it too clearly. This is Wilson German. He actually, unfortunately, he passed away from COVID. But he was one of the White House beloved doormen, elevator operators. And again, many of these men I interviewed, and Wilson in particular for my book, he said, I'm going to go to my grave with a lot of secrets. So there were things that he would never talk about. But, there was obviously Cheney was a very, very powerful vice president. And when I talked to Dick Cheney for this book, he wanted to talk a lot about Gerald Ford, actually, and reminisce about the time that he was working in the White House in a different administration. I think the relationship with Bush was much more fraught and difficult, and they are still not very close. But Cheney was very open about Donald Trump when we spoke, and he was concerned at the time that we spoke, and this is back in 2017. I think we have this image of the Obamas and the Bidens being very, very tight, but there was obviously a lot of frustration, especially when Biden came out in support of gay marriage. And he did this before Obama had come out and supported gay marriage. Obama had said that his views were evolving on gay marriage, and Biden just went ahead in a national interview and said he supported it. And so I think for a vice president, you're never supposed to obviously go out ahead of the president. But he pushed him forward on the issue. Of course, Mike Pence, Walter Mondale, and Joe Biden. I mentioned this, that, Walter Mondale, he was seen as the kind of quintessential vice president, and every vice president following him looked up to him because Carter gave him a lot of responsibilities. And Mike Pence had a lot of respect for Walter Mondale. But I was told again and again that he was way too nice to be president. And he really was. He was a very humble, wonderful man. And my last book is about Elizabeth Taylor, but we're not talking about that today. This is a book I wrote that came out in 2020, Team of Five. It's about the President's Club in the age of Trump. And what's interesting is I've noticed recently on Twitter and social media that Valerie Jarrett and other folks who worked for Obama have posted this photo that's signed by each of the presidents. And it reminded me, there's a story in the book about this, that there are only a small handful of these photos that were given to each of the men who were there and then to their top aides. To get a signed photograph of each living president at the time is pretty remarkable. So this is Lyndon Johnson with Harry Truman, of course, and when he signed Medicare into law, he went to Independence, Missouri, and the first Medicare cards he gave to Harry Truman and his wife Bess, because it was the Trumans that inspired the Medicare system. So this is something that I think shows the deep respect that presidents have for the people of their same party who come before them traditionally. This photo I love because it shows Gerald Ford and Jimmy Carter, and what they had was a really unlikely friendship. I don't think a lot of people remember this, but when they were running against each other in 1976, there was a lot of intense animosity, so much so that Ford said that Carter seemed cold and arrogant and even egotistical. And Ford said that they were like oil and water, and this was in 76. And you flash forward just a few years later to 1981 when the Egyptian president Anwar Sadat was assassinated. And Reagan sent the former presidents and an envoy to go to Egypt for the funeral. And it's truly remarkable. I mean, you had Nixon, Ford, Carter, Rosalind, to show how active she was as a former first lady. She insisted on going on the trip as well. And Barbara Bush had a funny story where she's watching Rosalind Carter go on the trip, and she's just kind of shocked at how gutsy Rosalind was for wanting to do it, because she was not invited, but she went anyway. And in fairness, she really should have gone, because she is one of the people who came up with the idea for the meeting at Camp David and actually doing it there at Camp David. So I think it was fine that she was there. But it was really remarkable because this was in 1981, and we're just talking a few years after this bitter, bitter election. And they chatted on the 18-hour flight home and got so close together that they consoled each other about what it was like to be a former president. They promised to help each other. Ford agreed to co-chair several initiatives at the Carter Center. Carter agreed to participate in a conference at the Ford Library. And in 1989, I didn't realize this until I started working on this book, Ford even went with Carter to monitor elections in Panama. They teamed up on important policy issues too. In 1994, they joined forces with Ronald Reagan, which I didn't realize, in a plea to Congress to pass Bill Clinton's assault weapons ban. This is a matter of vital importance to the public safety, the bipartisan trio wrote in a letter to the House of Representatives. 4 years later, Carter and Ford argued for Bill Clinton, another member of the President's Club, to be censored instead of impeached during the Monica Lewinsky scandal. And Clinton had actually called Ford and asked for his advice at the time. And Ford said, Bill, you have to be straightforward with the American people about what's happened. And you have to be honest, because this is not going away. The two former presidents wanted to avoid a Senate trial because they worried that it would tear the country apart. And I think it's very much in keeping with Ford's personality, seeing as he pardoned Nixon for Watergate and the sense of trying to keep the country together. It's almost as though he saw himself as the father of the country, trying to hold everyone together. They grew so close, Carter said, that when they went to events together, they rode in the same car, and they kind of hated once they got there because it meant their conversation was done. And when I went down to Plains and interviewed President Carter, he said it's an intimate and pure friendship. And in 2006, shortly before he passed away, Gerald Ford called Jimmy Carter and asked him to give the eulogy at his funeral. And, Carter said, he of course said yes, and would you do the same for me? And in his eulogy, which is so sweet and kind, and he was sad, he said, I was grieved that it was me doing it for him, that he passed away first, And he said in his eulogy, you learn a lot about a man when you run against him for president, and when you stand in his shoes and assume the responsibilities that he has borne so well. And perhaps even more after you both lay down the burdens of high office and work together in a nonpartisan spirit of patriotism and service. Jerry and I frequently agreed that one of the greatest blessings that we had after we left the White House during the last quarter century was the intense personal friendship that bound us together. And so that's a really beautiful thing. And the Clinton and Bush 41 H.W. Bush relationship, while not as close, has brought them together in times of crisis. This is after the tsunami. They worked together on many issues. Famously, the Michelle Obama and Bush friendship is quite sweet as well. Here they are at the dedication of the George W. Bush Presidential Library. Sometimes you notice Carter sort of standing off on the side, and I think it's because Jimmy Carter, if there was an outcast from the group, it probably was him. And now it's somebody else. You can imagine who that is. And he doesn't care, of course, he says. So Jimmy Carter, he said what he thought, and he would write op-eds published in the New York Times that said, Bill Clinton's wrong about how to solve the crisis in the Middle East. I mean, he came right out and criticized sitting presidents. And there is, and I go through in the book, a certain code of ethics, that you have to follow, and you're not supposed to criticize the sitting president. It's just not a good look, but you have to respect him for always saying what's on his mind. And when I interviewed Donald Trump for this book, and I went down to Plains and talked to the Carters for this book, and one of the things that the Carters said was that, I asked Jimmy Carter what he felt about Donald Trump. And this was, several years ago. So it was either 2017 or 2018. And he said, Ronald Reagan lied too. So I'm not going to make any comments. And Rosalind Carter said, Jimmy, come on, this is very different. So Rosalind was the more outspoken of the two, which as a journalist, I very much enjoy. She's a fantastic woman, and she gets very annoyed because people still mispronounce her name and say Rosalind. And she still can't believe that people can't get her name right, even though she was First Lady of the United States. She kept saying it's Rosalind. They have a unique bond, and it's actually interesting, and I was going to say earlier, since we are here at the Hauenstein Center, and Hauenstein obviously was a top intelligence officer and worked for President Eisenhower during World War II. One quote from Eisenhower really resonated with me, and I lead the book off with it. And Eisenhower said, "This country is far more important than any of us." And I think that is the kind of point of the book, really, is that these are men that, while they are very different in their philosophies and how they lived their lives and how they got to the pinnacle of power that they did get to, they all believe that the country and a peaceful transfer of power and the Constitution, I mean, these are things that they believe strongly in. So there's a sense that they're all bound together. This is at the dedication of the Smithsonian African American History Museum, which is incredible in Washington. The Michelle Obama, George W. Bush friendship is sweet. I mean, they're always seated together at events where, because of the order in which they served in the White House, they're always seated together. So they developed a friendship, and it's just really personality. I mean, George W. Bush makes silly jokes, he says, and she laughs at them, and so this is the back of my head because I couldn't find my other photo with Donald Trump, but I was there with Sarah Sanders, who is now governor, amazing, in the Oval Office, and he was incredibly interested in talking about how he would fit into the President's Club. He was very blunt, and he said he didn't think he'd fit in very well at all, And I think that he feels just a sense of obviously being an outsider, and he's really kind of clinging to that as we see today. But I did ask him about Jefferson and Adams, and famously, they were rivals, and that towards the end of their lives, there's this beautiful letters between them. They famously died on the same day. So these bitter enemies go on to become great friends. And I asked him if he thought he and Bill Clinton might do the same. And he did say anything is possible, but I don't think that's possible. But I think he also liked being mentioned in the same breath as Jefferson and Adams. I do think he's in very much proud of having been president, obviously. He wants to do it again, which is very rare. And here are you have the first ladies in this picture. Obviously, there's just a lot of, I stopped researching this book I stopped researching the first ladies really at the beginning of the Trump era. And I did a little bit on Melania Trump, but I have to say that I found her to be just very difficult to get to know, kind of a cipher. And I'm sure that this isn't surprising to anyone. She didn't like the White House. But I did think it was interesting that she didn't move in right away. And I know Michelle Obama was jealous of that. You know, she was like, God, I should have done that. Like, I couldn't have gotten away with that. I mean, that's changing the rules completely. And maybe we shouldn't have that rule. You know, it just kind of brings up whether or not some of that is necessary. Do we need a first lady to live in the White House? I think if they don't want to, they shouldn't have to, but I think it's important to not take that job lightly, and you should do something with it because you have an incredible opportunity as first lady. So that is my presentation, and I would love to answer any questions about presidents, first ladies, or Elizabeth Taylor, if you happen to be fans, because my last book was the first authorized biography of Elizabeth Taylor. So I worked on it with her family and got to go through all of her diaries and letters, and it was an incredible experience. And very different from this, because I got to interview Demi Moore and Whoopi Goldberg and Colin Farrell. So not a lot of, although she did do a lot for HIV and AIDS, so I did talk to Dr. Fauci about what she knew about different AIDS treatments at the time too. So that was very relevant to what we were going through. But if anyone has any questions, please don't be shy. Do you have a question? Or are you getting up to leave? No? Yes?
As they introduced you and listed your multiple positions and credential, one word, of course, maybe with this last week, pops off the resume when they say Fox News. So what are your thoughts about the recent revelations about what some of the on-air personality thought and believed, and then what they conveyed to the public as a journalist?
Well, thank you for that question. I think it's, I was there to just defend myself a little bit. I was there in 2005 and 2006. So I was there for about a year, and I left because the work environment was quite, if you've seen any of the TV movies about Roger Ailes, I know very well some of those I wasn't personally involved in it, but I could see a lot of what was going on was very wrong behind the scenes. And so I guess I'm sadly not surprised by some of that. It's very cynical, and I think that it's obviously really sad that we live in a country where people are so divided and then not being given the truth, or having the truth spun in such a deeply cynical way where you know what the truth is, but you're then going to say something different. So yeah, that's what I would say. I hope that we've moved. I always hope that we've moved forward a bit, especially in terms of like the Me Too movement, which is separate from what you're asking about, but in terms of how women are treated in the workplace, because it was a terrible place to work for a young woman. So I hope that coming to light has been helpful. Yes.
Can you explain the role of religion in the White House and how that impacts how a president runs the country?
Gosh, that's such a good question that I have literally never been asked before. So thank you for that. I mean, there is a strong, separation of church and state, but I think that every president feels a certain level of responsibility, that they go to church, that there is a sense that there is a belief in a higher power and all of that. But I think there's a really strong desire to act as though you're serving everybody, whether they're Christian, Jewish, Muslim. So I think the most well, aside from George W. Bush, I know Jimmy Carter is extremely religious. And, I went to his Sunday sermon at Maranatha Baptist Church in Plains, and he just deeply believes in his Christianity. And that's why I think he's so very at peace with what's happening now and with, his health deteriorating. But so I think that I think it's a wonderful thing that there isn't as much pressure in this country to kind of have religion be part of leadership. I know that Donald Trump had some, Christian leaders in the White House, but in the other presidents that I've studied, there's really been a desire to kind of keep that personal. And the Bushes kept it mostly personal too. I mean, Bush Sr., George W. Bush obviously talked about his Christianity, but I think there's a belief that that's really something for your family and it's something really personal. Yes. Oh.
Loved your talk today and the lunch talk today. Thank you so much. My question is with President Biden, what do you think his post-presidency will look like compared to the other post-presidencies, and how do you think he fits in? Because I know Trump's a different case, and I know Biden's now a different case kind of too, now in this new political reality we have. So just wanted to know your thoughts on that.
Yeah, thank you. Biden's the first senator to endorse Jimmy Carter. So I think that Biden will fit in really well with the President's Club if that were to happen. I think that, he's certainly obviously friendly with Obama. I think that he's a Washington creature. He's a creature of what, even though he would probably say he's not. I mean, almost 40 years in the Senate. He knows all of the players. He's deeply part of this club. I think that he would fit in really well as a former senator too. He's all about kind of tradition. I think one thing about Biden, and I interviewed Dr. Biden too, is that there is a sense that they've been in Washington for so long that there is a cynicism and a concern that they have. And Biden, when he was vice president, and I traveled to Mongolia with him, and then I went to California with him on a fundraising trip, and he came to the back of the plane, and I was the only person on the plane because VPs don't, Air Force Two is not like a hot ticket, not like Air Force One. And he came to the back of the plane and started chatting with me. And he was so nice and so sweet and warm and all those things that you think of with Joe Biden. And his press secretary came running back and practically dragged him out because you just never know what he's going to say. And he just didn't want him to say anything. And I think that he's been through that enough that now everything seems, there's just this layer of not always saying what you think. And I did ask Dr. Biden as an English professor, and it's incredible that she's still teaching as First Lady. I think that's really important that a First Lady can continue their career. I asked her what her favorite book was. And we were at a little luncheon, and she said, I don't really have one off the top of my head. And later I thought, she definitely has a favorite book. She's an English professor, but whatever she says could be picked apart, right, by the press. And so I think it's really kind of sad that you can't really say anything when you're in that position. So in that way, he won't be like Jimmy Carter. He will not be criticizing the sitting, whoever comes after him. Does anyone else have any questions? No Elizabeth Taylor, Richard Burton questions for me? Just a little. Well, if you're interested in love letters and romance and passion and diamonds, that's the book. Very different from this. She fought her way out of the studio system and then became the first celebrity influencer, which is why I wanted to write the book, because she started her own perfume empire and made hundreds of millions of dollars along the way. And then she used that money to help found AMFAR, which I think is pretty incredible, and help lessen the stigma attached to people living with HIV and AIDS and the homophobia that she witnessed throughout her life. And I thought, if you weren't familiar with what it was like in the 80s for people living with AIDS, it was, you couldn't have a job, crosses were burned in front of your house. I mean, it was a terrible, terrible thing, and there were no treatments. And it's because of Elizabeth that I think we now have treatments, not a cure, but there are treatments. And I think that without her, our culture would be different. So that's a real celebrity, kind of in this Betty Ford way. I think the fact that what she did for HIV and AIDS, similarly to Betty Ford with addiction after she left the White House with the Betty Ford Center, it's what you can do to help move the needle in the culture that I think makes these women so effective. Anyone else? Yes.
So you've talked a lot about how strong a media influence can have on what many of the presidents and first ladies and all those higher up people in the White House can have on what they can say, such as in interviews. So not just with those people, but also with some of the past presidents that you've been able to talk through for getting resources for these books. What was their stance on how strongly the media kind of affected them?
I think that, it just goes with the territory once you've gotten to the presidency. And that's why I think Biden is an interesting case, because you could see slowly, he still does occasionally put his foot in his mouth or say things that he shouldn't say, but you see the layers of protection that develop and the ways they're kind of kept from reporters too, like the story I told about being dragged off the plane, from the aisle of the plane. I think that they learn over time that they really can't say much of anything without it being picked apart. I think there's a lot of frustration in just how, if you're watching MSNBC, you're getting one story. If you're watching Fox, you're getting another. It's very hard to have a middle ground now. And then a lot of the false information that is out in social media that's just impossible to combat. I think it's a really difficult time in the media landscape because people are reading things on Facebook that are, bots are producing, and they're not real news. And I think, younger people like you might, question, well, where is the actual news? Where do I get the truth? Maybe this sounds a little institutionalist, but I do think, the Washington Post, the AP, Reuters, those sites I think do give you a fair picture of what's going on if you're looking at the news. Some people might say the New York Times is left-leaning and the Post is left-leaning, but at least you're getting a better view of what's happening than some strange Facebook story that's being sent into your feed, Yeah. Yes.
So how big of a role do you think social media will have on future presidencies, especially with Twitter and new growing social media sites?
Thank you. I hope not much, but I'm sure a lot. I don't know. I think it's so scary what's out there now. And all of this information that is just patently false and people believing lies and then acting on them. I think what we saw on January 6th is an example of just misinformation. And it's really scary. And so I hope that, and now with Elon Musk at Twitter, I'm not sure what's going to happen, but I think it's such a good question. It's really interesting to see what's going to happen. But I think that, you can't turn back time. We have to learn how to filter out the truth from lies. And I hope people have a sense of history and a sense of what's not true, but, we'll see. And yes?
Did you enjoy the West Wing?
Yes, love the West Wing. Love the West Wing. Love Downton Abbey and The Crown and all of those shows that kind of give you a peek behind the curtain. Yeah.
What's the residency going to be
The resident show, they're filming it like next week. They're starting to film. They're filming in LA, and they announced the lead character, because it's going to be a detective. It's a murder mystery. So it's kind of loosely inspired by the book, which is great. But and it is a woman whose name I can't think of right now, but she was in Orange is the New Black. And so it's going to be very cool to see.
Thank you, Kate, so much for your lecture. And my question is, Melania Trump is the second first lady who was an immigrant. So I had high hopes on her bringing an impact on multicultural and have her do something towards that versus anti-bullying campaign. Do you feel that was a missed opportunity on her part? And second question, how would the First Lady select their cause?
Thank you. I agree with you. It would have been a great opportunity for her to use her platform as the second First Lady after Louisa Adams to be an immigrant. I think that she's very tricky to figure out. I had interviewed Stephanie Grisham, who was her chief of staff, and then she was press secretary for a time, but she never gave a press briefing, so you might not know who she is. And she was very supportive of how, it took Michelle Obama a lot of time to come up with her Let's Move campaign. And so it was going to take Melania a lot of time to come up with her campaign too, she told me. It took a long time for Melania to come up with her campaign. She really, what she did try to do with opioid abuse, I think was important. But I don't think she really leaned into any one thing. And so I think that she just never kind of found that cause. And I just think she was so miserable. She did not want to be in Washington, and she wasn't interested in, although I was told that she had read a lot of books about First Ladies, including mine, and so everyone else's, anyone who's written about White House history, I was told she's read their book. I don't see that in terms of what she did, because it is kind of a wasted opportunity. But you could argue if she didn't really want to be there in the first place, perhaps that was a discussion they could have had before he ran for president. I think she was probably pretty stunned that he won too, right? So she wasn't expecting it. But I think you're right. It would have been a good opportunity. Anybody else? Yes.
You have tremendous credentials, and you've spent a lifetime at it and are extremely well qualified, and I recognize that. In that position, with all your experience, do you believe that the media has the right to slant, to do whatever they want to do? And if you don't, how would you propose to control that?
Oh my gosh. Thank you for the compliments at the beginning of that question. I really, like I was saying earlier, I don't think there is any way to stop false information, or, I think that there can be some way for traditional media, because there were times when I would have meetings with my boss at one of the places I worked, where they would say, I've heard that this is happening and we need to write a story proving that this is happening. And that's not, like internal White House intrigue. It was a story about, nobody likes this one person working in the White House, and let's write a story about how nobody likes them. That's just a misuse of information, and it's also something they probably just picked up at a cocktail party the night before, and it's not real. So I think sometimes there is slanting in terms of how you're going to prove your thesis, right, in any news organization. But I'm not sure how you fix it. I don't think that I would be a bazillionaire if I knew the answer to that. So I really don't know, but I think it's an excellent question, and we have to figure out a way to get, to weed out especially with social media, the completely false information that's out there. But I still do believe that, like the reporting out of Ukraine and the New York Times and the Washington Post, that's really, they're not making that up, I believe that those resources are still have a lot of integrity.
Thank you so much, Kate. We have
Thank
one
you.
more question from our virtual audience.
Yeah, so as we've been listening to your presentation tonight, it's clear that you've had the opportunity to interview some really incredible people. And I have to imagine that these are people that it's really hard to get on their calendars. How do you convince these people to sit down and have a conversation with you? And then even further than that, open up about their private lives?
I think once you get one person, it's much easier to get the other one. So if you're doing any research project or any journalism, if you get that one person, in the case of the First Ladies, I got Barbara Bush to agree to do something. And then you take that interview and you go to every other First Lady's office and say, well, Mrs. Bush and I are talking. And so suddenly you really, I'm working on a book now, which is, I'm still in the process of researching, but I need to get that one person. And then you get this kind of cascade of goodwill because they know that you're trusted. And but it is really hard, and that's why it takes the hardest part of reporting about the presidency, I'm sure anybody will say, is just getting through the people that surround the primary person that you're trying to get to, because they're very protective, and they should be. So thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you very much.
Well, that was certainly a very special way to commemorate this year's President's Day. And so, again, I want to thank our friends at the Ford Presidential Library and Museum, and also thank Kate once again for such wonderful stories. One quick story that I want to share. We all know that we're here tonight because of Ralph Hauenstein and his life and legacy, which we now emulate in our mission to raise up the next generation of 21st century leaders. I was recently able to have lunch with one of his great-granddaughters, and she shared a very lovely story with me about how she and Ralph used to be pen pals when she was a child and growing up. And we often think about Ralph as a veteran and an entrepreneur and a spy even, but it's also great to think of him as a pen pal. So I'm just really struck by the humanity that Kate brought to us tonight, of all these storied leaders that we've admired and watched and learned from over the years. And I hope you take that into your conversations tonight out in the exhibition hall. That brings us to the close of our formal programming, but we do hope you'll join us for some dessert and conversation. We will also have sales and signing of Kate's books, so be sure to check that out. Just a couple reminders, if you're interested in a few more stories, we did just publish the podcast, our podcast, Off the Stage, which features Kate, so you can go check that out and take in a little bit more. Also, if you know of any students who are interested in the Peter Cook Leadership Academy, applications for that close Friday, so encourage them to get them in. And finally, we hope to see some of you on Thursday for our Talking Together event in partnership with the Padnos Sirosic and also the Kauffman Institute with Valerie Cower. So that'll be at 7 o'clock, reception at 6 on Thursday. With that, I will bid you a great evening. Thank you so much for being here, and enjoy the rest of your night.